Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm joined by Dr Alan McKay. Alan, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Dan.
Really looking forward to this conversation today. We're going to be talking about mental toughness. We're going to be unpacking a paper that you've done recently. But before we do that, let's get started. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so as you alluded to, I'm Dr Alan McKay. I'm based down in Cardiff, currently working at the University of South Wales, but as you can probably tell, I'm not, not having the strongest Welsh accent in the world. So from Dublin originally, background in psychology, moved over, I suppose, to pursue a career in sports psychology. Worked and lived up at Liverpool with Liverpool John Moores, and then moved down to Cardiff about 8 years ago now. And been down here ever since, doing research, working as a PhD student at the University of South Wales, and where this kind of paper came out of. And I'm still based down here now doing some research and some applied work, and loving life down here.
And you've recently completed your PhD, so you've recently become doctor.
Yeah, so I was one of those fools who decided to do my PhD and my applied practice training at the same time. So completed my PhD, just over a year ago, and then fortunate just to completed my QSEP stage 2 training there quite recently as well. So lots of fun experiences, lots of spinning plates, but really enjoyed both experiences.
So life has been busy. Why sports psychology, Alan? What got you into sports psychology in the first place?
It's a great question. I suppose if I pull it back further, I got into psychology because I was just really interested in people, and I was always told growing up that I was a great listener. I was a really good friend, and I always just really enjoyed having conversations with people. Unfortunately, maybe I had a few friends growing up who struggled with their mental health, and they often sought out me for advice. And I guess I just wanted to explore that in a bit more depth, which originally drew me to psychology. And then the nature of psychology degrees is that they're quite broad and general, so you can still go into a lot of areas once you've completed your undergrad. And sports psychology is just something that made sense for me. I'm quite passionate about sport, played rugby, bit of golf, did a bit of swimming growing up, and I just thought, why not apply my two passions together, psychology into the domain of sport. That's really how it came about in the first place.
So you played all sports. You didn't necessarily specialise in one.
No, if I was to say I specialised, rugby is probably the one I got furthest in. Played quite a reasonable level at school and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm kind of a jack of all trades. And right now, I still play a couple of sports casually, and I'll probably watch any sport on TV. So yeah, I just love it. Absolutely love it.
The rugby's pretty strong in Ireland right now, right?
Yeah, we're doing okay. I think they called it the British and Irish Lions this summer. I think it was 90% the Irish Lions, but
as an Englishman, I hope Ireland celebrate Ireland's success, but I would love to see some more English players in that.
As an English coach, so.
This is true. Who's the head coach of Ireland as well, or has been head coach of Ireland?
Exactly.
Yeah. So Liverpool John Moores, first degree in psychology. Liverpool John Moores, masters in sports psychology at Liverpool John Moores.
Correct. Yeah, masters in sports psychology.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best places in the world to do that.
Yeah. Well, that's what I figured. So I suppose for a bit more context, in Ireland at the time, there wasn't any accredited degrees in sports psychology, and the equivalent to the BPS over there is called the PSI, Psychological Society of Ireland. And so really, when I decided I wanted to pursue this, I knew I was going to have to go abroad. And so I started to research some of the degrees, and two of the ones that popped up for me were John Moores and Loughborough seemed to be the two of the really good options. And just to be honest, I applied to John Moores and I had good conversations with Dr. Mark Nesty, who was there at the time. And a number of the staff just seemed very friendly and very open and very receptive to my questions. And so that kind of helped me make the decision.
Well, there's many great programs now, master's programs for aspiring sports psychology practitioners, and two you've mentioned there, Loughborough and Liverpool John Moores, are definitely two of the best amongst many great ones. Mm-hmm. Mental toughness.
Yes.
Part of your PhD here, this paper we're going to unpack, mental toughness was something that you became interested throughout your master's degree?
Yes. So I suppose it probably really stemmed, if I was to think about it. It was a topic that obviously came up. I don't think you can talk about sports psychology or study sports psychology without the topic of mental toughness coming up, whether it be in lots of critical debates around it, I suppose. So obviously I studied it during my master's, but it really probably started to crop up a bit more once I moved down to Cardiff and started my research assistant role at the University of South Wales. In essence, we were in partnership with the Football Association of Wales, and it was a concept they were interested in exploring in a bit more depth, particularly around this idea of players within their international squads who were making the transition from club to international environment and back again. A word that frequently came up in early conversations with coaches was these players need to be mentally tough if they're going to consistently make that transition and perform to a reasonably consistently high level when they're in this environment. And I suppose that's where it initially came up, this kind of curiosity around, okay, well, we're hearing a lot of coaches use this term mental toughness, but as we know, Dan, it has a lot of different connotations within the literature. And I suppose it kind of led myself and my colleagues, including Professor Brendan Cropley at the University of South Wales, to ask, right, well, what actually does this look like within this environment? And more importantly, how can it be developed, I suppose, to better support players to demonstrate mental toughness both on and off the pitch, but also how can we educate coaches to help support players to develop this mental toughness on and off the pitch within these camps?
Well, let's dive into this paper. The paper is entitled Developing a Clarity of Mind, Exploring a Behaviour-Based Approach to Mental Toughness Development in International Youth Soccer. And you've got some stars who have co-authored this paper, Professor Brendan Cropley, David Shearer, Sheldon Hanton, some incredible sports psychologists and researchers. So you had a great team there. I think my first question is to dive a little bit deeper into the definition of mental toughness for us. What do you mean by mental toughness, and is there a specific definition you use in this paper?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's probably the $1 million question when it comes to mental toughness, isn't it? I think there's been a lot of definitions put out there.
So many
And
definitions.
yeah, when I started diving into this literature in a bit more depth for my PhD, and it definitely initially came a bit overwhelmed by the amount of different definitions that have been used over the years. I suppose the kind of definition we ended up using for this paper was one provided more recently by a researcher down in Australia called Daniel Gucciardi, who defined it as a personal capacity to produce consistently high levels of subjective or objective performance despite everyday challenges and stressors, as well as more significant adversities. And I suppose the reason, to unpack that a little bit, the reason we kind of chose that definition was it's kind of innately linked to the actual stress process and the process of trying to learn to perform under pressure. So that definition kind of, it summarizes mental toughness, I suppose, as this capacity, this potential for action, for want of a better phrase. Um, and it relates it to both everyday challenges. So, for example, maybe just the physical demands of trying to get through a training session, as well as those kind of more significant challenges or adversities, such as maybe deselection or overcoming a long-term injury or that type of thing. I think a lot of times when people think of mental toughness, they think of this ability to endure through the most significant adversities, whereas we settled with this definition as a kind of really, it outlined how mental toughness is something that needs to be used in the everyday. It's not just when facing these kind of big, massive hurdles or massive challenges.
So, am I hearing you correctly? This is quite a broad definition of mental toughness, in as much as it takes in the everyday challenges that one faces, but also the in-game challenges that might be thrown at you under pressure. Is it the best of both worlds, essentially?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of summarizing it. I think the kind of key point to remember here is context is key. And when we're
Mm,
talking about something as broad as mental toughness in as broad a domain as sport and performance sport, um,
mm.
it's very difficult to be extremely specific when trying to provide that type of definition. And in fact, I don't think you'd want to be, because it's naturally going to adapt to your capacity to produce consistently high levels of performance in one sport. It's going to be reliant on one set of behaviors and one set of skills, and that's probably going to adapt and change as you move to different sports. So yeah, you're quite right. It is naturally quite broad and quite all encompassing. And so it really just offered us a starting point for this paper and this piece of research, just providing a kind of broader definition.
Yeah, because to speak to your point about the challenge of defining it, I mean, it does feel like, and there's lots of definitions out there, maybe without drawing on one specific one, as you've mentioned, context and the temporal nature of the definition has been accounted for, hasn't it? In as much as, using another term here, grit, and not mental toughness. Grit has been used more from the perspective of sort of the long term, mid to long term, dealing with the day-to-day challenges, that feels a little bit more outside the domain of in-game. Whereas I know there's been some mental toughness definitions around those mini moments during games where you might drop down to what I would describe as a low performance mindset. But what you're doing in this paper is you're covering both bases. It sort of encompasses this notion of grit over the long term and the capacity to keep playing, keep executing actions in the short term whilst adversity strikes.
100%, 100%. And I think just to tie it in to the kind of the context in which we're operating here, within the Football Association of Wales context, these players, as you said, are trying to deliver in these mini moments on each individual international camp. They're trying to, overcome these stressors, trying to play against international opposition, trying to secure their place in the team, trying to learn from mistakes, trying to reflect, trying to work with their coaches. But there's also that bigger long-term goal, or the bigger adversity of, am I going to make it? Am I going to be in this squad long-term? Can I play international football for the foreseeable future? And obviously transitioning back into their club environments as well. Am I going to secure a scholarship in that environment? Am I going to go on to play? So you're right, it's kind of a balance of the two, really. The mini moments, trying to perform in the here and now, while also having that kind of maybe longer-term goal or longer-term challenge in mind as well.
And it's interesting with that definition, you used two words there, objective and subjective.
Mm-hmm.
And, just drawing on what you said, that am I going to make it? Sort of that day-to-day narrative, feels a lot more subjective, the subjective narrative that individuals are having from day to day based on what they're experiencing in the game. But obviously the paper is also exploring this behaviour-based approach. So the objective actions and behaviours that players are engaging in, aligning with mental toughness. So objective and subjective, which again leads to the feeling that this is a fairly broad definition here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as we both know, in psychology, it can be quite difficult to measure the objective. And so I think naturally with a definition like this, we're focusing about the individual and their subjective, and, am I performing well enough? Am I reflecting on my performances? What can I learn? What went well? What didn't? What do I need to improve? While also focusing on the more objective stuff in terms of, in a football context, number of tackles made, number of passes made, percentages of possession. As we know, it's becoming more and more about metrics and data and stuff in football now. And so I think concepts such as mental toughness, measuring them on that kind of both subjective and objective level, we're trying to provide as much feedback and useful information to players as possible as they try to continue to develop these kind of characteristics.
And is it that call for that objective measurement that lies behind the history of this paper in terms of, exploring a behaviour-based approach to mental toughness development, that, coaches, the Football Association of Wales, other governing bodies are looking for ways to measure mental toughness from a behavioural and an overt behavioural perspective? Can you dive into the history of this, why, in the history of exploring a behaviour-based approach? What is a behaviour-based approach?
Yeah, really good question. I suppose a behaviour-based approach, in the way we kind of approached in this paper, was more focusing on trying to break down this kind of broad concept of mental toughness into specific, context-specific or other behaviours within this environment. Because if mental toughness is this kind of broad capacity that entails a range of different cognitions or skills, or, like I said, this kind of potential for action, then a behavior-based approach, it's almost this kind of bottom-up approach of like, right, well, what does mental toughness actually look like in this environment? What can we see on the pitch? What can we hear on the pitch? And the same applies obviously for off the pitch as well. So it's really kind of working from the bottom up, starting with, okay, well, what behaviors do players need to display? And two, do coaches want to see players display? And staff want to see players display both on and off the pitch. And then once we have kind of a framework for what those behaviors look like are in place, and how they can be developed, we can then start to better support players in developing those behaviours and the capacity to display those behaviours under pressure, reflect on them, and use them again in the future. And we can also start to support coaches and other key individuals within players' environments in helping to support them or provide them with strategies, I suppose, to help them start to develop those behaviours. So in essence, a behaviour-based approach is just, it's starting from the bottom up. It's starting with what are the behaviours we're looking for? How are we linking this capacity of mental toughness, this higher order capacity, if you like, to the actual ability to perform under pressure? And the way we see it as behaviour is kind of the link between those kind of two key metrics. And that's really what a behaviour-based approach in this study, anyway, what we sought to do.
And this was a collaboration with an international football governing body?
Yes, it was. Yeah. So it was with the Football Association of Wales, the international governing body. In essence, they helped to fund my PhD position, so I was very fortunate to be funded by them. And so I guess it was an organisational based PhD, or applied PhD, if you like. So very much the aims of this study were driven by the desires of the association, the technical directors, and the higher ups within that kind of association. So it wasn't just a case of us going, "Oh, I'm curious to explore what mentally tough behaviours look like and how they're developed." It was actually driven by our conversations with the organisation, who knew they wanted players to be more mentally tough, but maybe struggled to understand, one, what those behaviours look like, and two, how they as coaches could help to develop them. They were very open and very receptive to psychological support, but they displayed maybe a lack of confidence in their own ability to develop these kind of psychological characteristics, such as mental toughness within their players. So that's really where the PhD kind of came about from.
Understood. Take us through the method here then. Who were the participants, and what was the approach here? How did you start to study these behaviours?
Yeah, so I guess the kind of participant pool was sampled because we wanted to develop a shared understanding of the mental toughness development process. So what I mean by that is, perhaps previous studies have focused on one specific group and their perception of mental toughness. So it might be talking to players about what they perceive mental toughness to be or what they perceive it to look like. Perhaps talking, in some other studies, have talked to coaches or talked to sports psychologists. We were interested in creating a more shared understanding of the mental toughness development process for the football organisation we were working with. The reason being that mental toughness, in this context, in an international football environment, they have very limited time to actually develop the construct, to develop mental toughness in camp. And so it's reliant on not just support from coaches, but also players' ability to understand and develop their own mental toughness, and perhaps even support from parents and other individuals outside that context. And I suppose with that all in mind, our participant sample therefore was players who were playing international youth football, parents of these youth international football players, coaches, performance coaches, so head coaches, assistant coaches, and also support staff who were involved in the camp and who were involved, I suppose, in reinforcing these mentally tough behaviours and helping to instill a sense of mental toughness, which included physiotherapists, education and welfare officers, performance analysts, a whole range of different individuals, just to kind of help create that kind of the shared understanding. And then I suppose using that sample, we kind of conducted either interviews or focus groups with these participants to gain a better understanding of the mental toughness behaviours players are required to develop and display in international youth football, the different contexts that require mentally tough behaviours in international youth football. So that might be a training environment, it might be in competition, in games, it might also be off the pitch, it might even be away from the international environment at home with their parents or in their club environments, to try and help reinforce and keep developing these mentally tough behaviours. And thirdly, also how these key personnel, coaches, support staff, parents, even teammates, can also support players to develop these mentally tough behaviours. So they were kind of the key areas we wanted to address within these interviews or focus groups with these participants.
So the big moment, unpack the results for us. These interviews, the interviews 1-to-1, I'm guessing, focus groups, players, parents, coaches, support staff. So a really broad array of key stakeholders in this project. Just unpack the results for us.
Yeah. So I guess overall, we found mental toughness is the capacity that players can develop it via relationships and with lots of key personnel within their wider environment. It was kind of a relational construct, a relational kind of multi-dimensional construct. And what I mean by that is players develop their mental toughness through their relationships with their teammates and with coaches, and also with support staff and with their parents across competitive training and developmental contexts. And I suppose then within these contexts, while they're trying to develop these mentally tough behaviors, they also experience a number of challenges that could kind of hinder their mental toughness development. So, for example, as I've already mentioned, international football is quite a time-limited environment. Players are typically only in there from anywhere between 4 to 5 days up to maybe a week and a half to 2 weeks if they're playing a couple of international games. And so they're trying to develop these kind of mentally tough behaviors, but they're also facing a number of challenges, such as the limited amount of time. But equally, they're also encountering opportunities to display this mental toughness capacity, both on and off the pitch. And I suppose we divided mentally tough behaviors from our findings into kind of two key areas. So you kind of had performance mentally tough behaviors, which were developed on the pitch, and then fundamental mentally tough behaviors, which were developed more off the pitch. Kind of performance mental tough behaviors, I'm talking about things such as learning to be adaptable. So having that kind of constant focus on what's going on around you, scanning, observation, being able to recover quickly from mistakes, maintaining positive body language, staying disciplined, even if the opposition are becoming ill-disciplined. In a training context, actively listening to coaches, looking to answer questions, doing a bit of extra training if you feel it's needed to work on specific skills, how you communicate with your teammates, that type of thing. And then off the pitch, it was more fundamental mentally tough behaviors. So things such as taking responsibility for your own development, seeking out support or advice if you feel you need it to improve on certain behaviors, learning to develop professional habits. So things such as recovering right, stretching, ice baths, making sure you get the right food, you're hydrated, you're getting to bed on time, learning those kind of behaviors. And then also being team oriented. Because this idea of mental toughness, it's fundamentally an individual characteristic or an individual capacity. But actually, what we found is an individual's capacity to be mentally tough and display mentally tough behaviors is also reliant on the ability of their teammates to also be mentally tough and display these behaviors. So you're actually having to develop trust with your teammates that you're all going to support each other to perform to the consistently high level under pressure. And so that requires supporting your teammates, maintaining high team standards in terms of how you train, in terms of how you recover, in terms of how you perform and reflect and feedback. And also maintaining kind of involvement in team decisions. So typically within these camps, coaches would set up kind of leadership groups of 4 to 5 players who would kind of almost be the bridge between the coaches and the players in terms of feeding back on how they felt training was going, if anything needed to be adapted, if there are any issues, that type of thing. So really just learning to take a bit more responsibility, I suppose, and develop this kind of cohesion and togetherness within the squad. And then I suppose the last one, which kind of really adds to what was already out there in the literature, is providing this link, as I mentioned before, between display of mentally tough behaviors and mental toughness development. I think a lot of studies have focused on if a player is or an athlete is mentally tough, then they display these behaviors. But not a lot of papers have previously made the link between, well, if we're displaying these mentally tough behaviors, how are athletes reflecting on those displays to then further develop their mental toughness for future situations. And so we also found that within this football environment, international football environment, it was important to engage in both formal and informal reflection. So players often reflected individually after training sessions and games on how they performed, what went well, what does it mean to me, what do I need to improve. They also often broke up into smaller units, typically based on positions, so maybe 3 or 4 defenders, 3 or 4 midfielders, 3 or 4 forwards, and they're provided with a range of clips to reflect on their behaviours in training, what they did or didn't do well. And they also engaged in team-based reflections, where the coaches would provide a range of clips and ask players to provide feedback on how they felt they did. And so through this, players were learning to reflect on successful and unsuccessful displays of mentally tough behaviour in the faces of challenges and adversities, and learning to how to cope better or more effectively, or how to adapt, either to reinforce positive displays of mentally tough behaviors for future situations, or learning why didn't I make the right decision under pressure? Why didn't I engage my capacity to display mentally tough behaviors correctly in that situation? What can I learn from it? Who do I need to talk to? What do I need to work on? And so that's kind of where this idea of a transactional approach comes into it. And this idea that mental toughness is developed not just through your display or lack of display of mentally tough behaviors, but also your ability to reflect, adapt, learn, and ultimately display those behaviors more effectively or continuously effectively in future similar scenarios.
I'd like to thank you for unpacking that. I mean, that's wonderfully deep and broad. I'd like to return to the first word that you used, which was relationships. I think that would surprise a lot of people. I
Yeah.
think probably the traditional viewpoint of mental toughness would be one that's internal to the player or players themselves. And yet what you've uncovered is that so much of mental toughness, the experience, the demonstration, and the development of mental toughness revolves around the quality of the relationships players have with coaches, support staff, and teammates. It has a very ecological feel to it. If I was to put my psychologist cap on here,
Yeah.
were you surprised by that yourself? Can you speak a bit more to that?
Um, yes, I suppose in a certain way we were slightly surprised by that. As you mentioned, it's kind of had a very kind of ecological feel to it. I suppose we set out to try and situate mental toughness and mentally tough behaviors within the wider environment.
Gotcha.
Um, but equally, the importance of relationships probably still surprised us to a certain extent.
Okay. From the interviews, as in it was heavily vocalized that these are the things that help me engage in mentally tough behaviors.
Yeah, yeah. Because I guess reflecting on it now, what we originally set out to do was focus on the intra-individual, both from a player perspective in terms of what mentally tough behaviors do I display or should I display, but and also from coaches and staff and parents in terms of what do they perceive to be the most important mentally tough behaviors and how are they developed. And so, what kind of, as you alluded to there, Dan, what kind of emerged out of it wasn't just to focus on the intra-individual or the individual, but also the kind of the wider, the ecological, the inter-individual, as it were, the relationships between players and coaches, staff and teammates, and the importance of those in developing mentally tough behaviors, but also the wider kind of environment and the wider kind of cultural factors and how those also fed into those relationships. So, for example, your ability to adapt to a time poor environment or some of the kind of organizational values and beliefs around, excellence, respect, togetherness, always supporting each other, always displaying that desire to go again or to fail and learn and that type of thing. And players' abilities to kind of take on board and instill those values within themselves or through those relationships as well. That all really came through. But yes, in answer to your question, I suppose it was a bit of a surprise initially, and we were probably focused more on the behaviors themselves, and then this kind of bigger relational piece came out of it.
Would you say that has repercussions for how we see mental toughness? That somebody isn't meant is it's not that somebody is mentally tough or not mentally tough. It's just that they have mentally tough moments or they display mentally tough behaviors, but they might not always do that. And that the relationships they have with coach, with players, fellow players, with support staff, with parents, are going to influence the amount of mentally tough moments that they might have.
100%, 100%. I think what we find kind of aligns quite well with previous work by Gucciardi and colleagues, where this idea of mental toughness as being both enduring and adaptable. I think in the past, mental toughness maybe has been portrayed, as you said, as this thing of like some people just naturally have it, and that might have been unconsciously the attitude some of our participants had coming into this. This idea of some people have it and some people don't. It's not necessarily something that gets kind of developed or something that you can learn over time. But yeah, that's something that's definitely come out from this study, is this idea of mental toughness being very much state-like, enduring and adaptable. So what I mean by that is you need to try and regularly display it across a range of different situations and a range of different contexts over time. But it's not always going to be there, as you said. Sometimes you're going to be lacking mental toughness. You're not going to display the right behavior under pressure. You're going to fail. You're going to make mistakes. And then it's about how you learn from that, how you reflect on it, how you adapt to similar future scenarios. And that's something that definitely came through in the piece, from certainly from talking to coaches and players.
Which has repercussions for how coaches think about the behaviours that they're seeing when it comes to conversations on mental toughness. I mean, it reminds me of the work of Dr. Mustafa Sarkar on resilience, and
Mm-hmm.
Mustafa's been on the show a few times, and really resilience being a close cousin, I suppose, to mental toughness, and very similar in as much as it's not that somebody is resilient or they're not resilient. They have moments of resilience.
Yeah.
But coming back to these coaching conversations when they're exploring, judgment and decision making, in their coach meetings, it's key. It influences the conversations that coaches have from their perceptions of behaviours, because it enables coaches to say, well, okay, we're seeing this, but this isn't necessarily a demonstration of who this player is. It's just a demonstration of how what they're exhibiting in the moment and how they're dealing with it in the moment. It's not that they don't have mental toughness. It's just that in that moment they didn't display that, and we need to make sure that we're putting the right opportunities in place and the right challenges in place and having the right relationship to enable this person to grow with their mental toughness.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mental toughness, as I mentioned at the start, is very much this capacity, this potential for action at any one moment or any one time. And we're not always capable of displaying that capacity or making the right decisions or choosing the right behaviours in certain moments. It's very much about developing that over time and learning to become more mentally tough, I suppose, within kind of specific contexts or specific situations, so that when we face similar future scenarios, it becomes more ingrained, I guess, for want of a better phrase. But you're right; it's very much mental toughness, very much your ability to adapt in the moment, use the characteristics at your disposal to adapt in the moment, rather than a reflection of who you are as a person or any of your deeper seated personality characteristics or anything like that. Which I think is a massive distinction.
You've divided mental toughness up between performance mental toughness and fundamental mental toughness being day to day.
Mm-hmm.
The performance mental toughness being on the pitch. From these interviews, did you find, I'm not too sure if you can answer this question, but from transcribing these interviews and from these conversations with these focus groups, was it that participants found it easier to describe and talk about performance mental toughness, which I suppose is a lot narrower? One thinks of the behaviours that one can engage in on the pitch or on the court or whatever. And if we're thinking about other sports or course, that feels a little bit more obvious. Whereas the day to day, the fundamental mental toughness, I wondered if participants maybe struggled to unpack that a little bit. I don't know if what I'm saying chimes true, but did you find that at all?
Um, yes, I would. I know. I think I know what you're getting at, and I would agree to a certain extent. It's not that they weren't able to unpack it; it probably just required a bit more digging. I think, as you said, when the term mental toughness comes up, and as I mentioned earlier on, it's something that the coaches in the organisation were keen to develop in players from the outset. When that term kind of came up, I think they very much viewed it from a performance on the pitch perspective. This football organisation has a prerogative to try and develop players for the international senior team to win games, to qualify for tournaments, to improve their standing on the international football scene. So I think it's only natural for them and for by proxy players and staff and parents and such to focus on the pitch behaviours, the kind of those mentally tough behaviours or performance mentally tough behaviours as we call them in the study, and kind of readily talk about them. And then probably took a bit more unpacking to kind of get into more of the fundamental stuff, the kind of what goes on behind the scenes, what goes on off the pitch. And because I think it's such a unique environment where they're coming in, as I said before, for anywhere from a couple of days up to like a week or two, and they're around each other all the time, and they're constantly interacting, they're constantly, whether it be talking about football or just having meals or just doing reflection sessions or even sometimes evenings playing games or just having a bit of relaxation or downtime. There's always behaviors going on, right? There's always things happening, and if we're talking about mentally tough behaviors and this link to the ability to perform under pressure, then that ability to do the fundamentals right is hugely important, and it's something once we got into the conversation that coaches and players and support staff all hugely valued, particularly around that piece around kind of supporting each other, and kind of taking responsibility for your own development. Not just waiting to be told, but actually going in and seeking out advice or guidance or doing the kind of the basics right, I suppose.
So, what are the implications here for coaches across both performance and fundamental mental toughness? What are the implications for coaches here in their day-to-day approach to coaching, their coaching practice? I'm guessing this has implications for session design. I'm guessing this has implications for coach behaviour and coach style. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you would unpack those implications?
Yeah, so there's probably a couple of different levels to this. In terms of just the broad implications that immediately came off the study in terms of coaching style, in these types of environments, we probably need to create a more system-led approach. What I mean by that is kind of create more psychologically informed environments where everyone is involved in the development of the psychological characteristics of players. So in this instance, the development of mental toughness. And that's done through kind of displaying more probably autonomy supportive behaviors. So giving players agency and ownership over displaying these behaviors. So for example, within this environment, one example was prior to going into training on set pieces, so things such as corners and free kicks, coaches gave players time to talk amongst themselves about where they position themselves, what worked well, kind of setting up their own middle sessions and running them and things like that. So just providing that bit of autonomy, really. But then off the pitch as well, in terms of creating psychologically informed environments, support staff, players, parents, coaches, everyone needs to be educated on what this thing called mental toughness is and what it looks like within their specific context, their specific environment. So I guess similar to what we've done in this study, probably different environments and different contexts probably need to create their own mental toughness development frameworks, complete with their own mentally tough behaviours that can be implemented within those environments. And that will probably require the support of a psych or someone like that in the first instance to help deliver that education piece and maybe help coaches to integrate that mental toughness development within their sessions rather than it just being a separate psychology piece. And really just, like I said, going back to that original point, just creating that kind of psychologically informed environment where psychology and mental toughness development is integrated within coaching sessions, within feedback, within even support staff sessions. A physio yoga recovery session can have mental toughness, and your ability to stay grounded, to stay centered in the moment off the pitch can also impact your ability to show that on the pitch and demonstrate that mental toughness. It can be applied across the board, really. So that would probably be the major implication of that.
A real all-in feel.
Yeah.
You've mentioned parents there. Was there anything that came out of the research paper that were specific for parents? Is it just a case of, well, look, educating parents and parents can support this, but was there anything specific that parents could do to support this process?
I think the big piece that came out in terms of parent support was just around probably both tangible and emotional support. I think a lot of parents, and rightly so, have this overwhelming desire to just be there for their child at all times. And, on the car ride home from training sessions or after an international camp, in this case, just talk through everything in detail. How was it? What went well? What didn't go well, etc., etc. But that doesn't work for everybody. And a lot of parents talked about, particularly at the age we're talking here. So for context, a lot of the players in this study were, the youngest was 15 and the oldest was about 18, 19. And so at that age, psychology shows us that children are growing up, who they rely on for that really close support often is starting to shift maybe from parents towards friends, towards coaches, towards other figures they respect in society. And so a lot of parents talked about the challenge of letting go and not maybe providing as much tangible support anymore, but maybe just emotional support, just being almost a sounding board for their child to come and talk to them about their concerns or their worries or just what happened in training without immediately feeling the need to kind of jump in and provide advice. And so I think that was kind of one of the kind of key things that came out, is letting your child come to you for support and guidance. And if they want help with developing these kind of mentally tough behaviors, particularly kind of more of the fundamental ones, probably around taking agency and responsibility for their own development. But probably alongside that, there's also been more an education piece for parents, because ultimately their child's going away for maybe a week at a time to a camp where they're not really sure what's going on or what they're working on, or when they come back, what can they be working on at home to maximize their chances of developing their mental toughness and getting back into that camp environment. And so another thing the organisation has done really well is start to divide parent education evenings on what the nature of the international environment looks like, what the day-to-day typically looks like, how parents can start to provide that support at home to help their child develop their mental toughness and maximise their chances of getting onto the next camp as well. So.
And I think important to emphasise, I mean, listen to what you're saying. Obviously, this research paper, the context here is young players engaged in international football, international soccer. Clearly very, very good players, but everything you're speaking to here is relevant for the grassroots level, isn't it? It's relevant for academy level. So everything that you're saying really does is relevant across the board. Just to close out this conversation today, I just want to dwell a little bit on what you said towards the end of your unpacking of the results, and that's I kind of wrote down display versus develop, display and develop.
Yeah.
And then it's more and also rather than either or. That obviously we want players, and the players want themselves to display mentally tough behaviours, and also be in the process of developing them. And you talked about reflection, and to me, that reflection has a real self-awareness piece that baked into everything we do. This all has to have an all-in feel. It's integrated into everything we do, session to session, day to day, and that really everything needs to be enveloped in reflection to build self-awareness. I suppose, no question, Alan, just a reflection back. That sounds like a really, really important piece if we're to help players develop their mental toughness.
Absolutely. And it just goes back to an earlier part of this conversation where we talk about mentally tough behaviors as kind of providing the link between your potential, so that capacity, your mental toughness capacity, your potential for action, and your ability to actually engage in action and perform under pressure. There's been lots of studies done on what do mentally tough behaviors look like within a specific environment. But there hasn't been maybe as much done on, okay, well, how do we know if a player is developing that mentally tough behavior? How are they developing their underlying mental toughness as a result? Because you could have a player, react quickly to mistakes, display positive body language, have a good pre-match routine, show composure on and off the ball, but they don't really always necessarily know why they're doing it, or certainly why it's linked to mental toughness, or certainly they might go away at the end of that game and go, wasn't that great? I played well today. I showed discipline under pressure. I performed consistently. Okay, on to the next one. And they haven't reflected on it. They haven't gone back and gone, well, what was it about that specific game or my mindset that allowed me to display those mentally tough behaviors, and how can I recreate that in the future? Equally, if I've fallen short in certain aspects, how can I reflect on that? How can I learn from that? Who do I need to talk to? What do I need to work on in order to improve on that in the future? And as I said, not just certainly within this international football environment, not just putting the onus on the individual. I think in the past, with a lot of mental toughness research, we've been guilty of going, well, either the athlete is mentally tough or they're not mentally tough, and that's on them. What this study helped us find was actually, no, it's a much bigger piece. It's about the environment. It's about accountability from coaches, parents, players, support staff, to create this kind of shared understanding and shared environment where mental toughness can be developed. And that comes into reflection as well. Reflection isn't just about reflecting individually as a player. It's also about reflecting with your unit, with your fellow teammates in your position, and also with the wider squad, and reflecting on clips, what went well, what didn't, what can I improve for next time when I face kind of similar future scenarios.
It's interesting, and I want to be respectful of your time because everything that's going on in my mind probably pushes me towards another 10 minutes here of doing a deep dive. But just reflecting back something, it's making me think of the importance, within a talent development pathway, again, whether it's international football or in an academy or a grassroots club, the importance of that metacognitive piece, again putting my psychologist cap on, thinking about behaviors, how perhaps historically the socio-cultural narrative around coaching has always been a fear of getting players to unpack what they're doing to make it conscious, because we don't want them to think too much. That player's just good at doing what they're doing, so why would we want them to think about what they're doing or consciously do it? But that's, again, a misunderstanding of the temporal nature and the contextual nature of mental toughness, because if we're not getting them to think about what they're doing and what makes them successful, yes, there can be an element of getting to are they going to overthink that? Probably not, but I can understand where people can be a bit concerned about that. But the point is, if we help them understand what they're doing when they're doing it well, that gives them a better chance to display that in the future, because they know what they've got to display. So it's asking coaches and asking key stakeholders in these environments to understand that, metacognition, thinking about behaviors, helping players reflect effectively isn't overthinking. It's helping them to think accurately about what they're doing, helping them be more flexible thinkers in the future. And then just finally, and really putting my psychologist cap on, thinking about the conversations I have had with Dr. Jamie Taylor and talking about epistemological chain. How do people learn over time? What resources are they using? When environments unpack the detail like this, it helps us understand, know, and improve that epistemological chain that young players have to learn from thinking about what they're doing. Again, no question, Alan, just a ramble back at you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I fully agree with all of that. I guess the other point, just to add on to the end of it, is by focusing on the behaviors first and then the cognitive piece after, we're just breaking it down into really simple blocks for both players and coaches as well. Like we started with the kind of the simplest unit, if you like, within psychology, which is behaviors. Because by focusing on behaviors within mental toughness, we're focusing on something that players have control over. Players understand behaviors intuitively, right? Oh, I know how to show composure on off the ball. I know what positive body language looks like. I know how to, or at least I've displayed these things before. I understand that. I get that. And from a coach's perspective, what we've talked about here in terms of the actual behaviors are nothing new. And this is something that came up in the focus groups with coaches, that, a lot of the stuff we're doing already, we're just not necessarily doing it systematically, right? Coaches are experts in identifying what behaviors they want to see in players. They're just not necessarily experts at systematically helping to develop them and using that to help them develop their cognition, their metacognition, their mindset, and their ability to maybe reflect, develop that self-awareness and perform more consistently under pressure. So I think that was just kind of the really kind of key piece here, was just how do we break this down into the kind of simple unit of behaviors that players can control and coaches understand and present it in their language for their context. Context is key here. And then kind of, just using that to help develop a better mentally tough, informed environment, if you like. And that's something we're now currently rolling out. I did another study after this where we rolled this out to try and support coaches as well. So that's maybe a future conversation about how kind of that piece went and how we went about navigating those challenges of working within the environment.
Well, you've answered my last question there, which was where was this heading? So that sounds really interesting. We'll have to get you back on to have a conversation about that. Alan, thank you so much for this. Really, really interesting. If I may ask to close things out here, how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in contact?
Alan McKay. My primary contact is probably through LinkedIn these days, either there or on X, or else if people are interested in following up and having conversations about this, you can even contact me through email, alan.mckay@southwales.ac.uk. I'm more than happy to take any questions or any follow-ups. I'm always keen to hear from other curious, like-minded people and to see how this can support them within their own environments to help athletes develop their own mental toughness. So again, Dan, just really thank you for the opportunity today to come on and talk about it. It's been a really, really enjoyable conversation.
No, thank you, Alan. Dr. Alan McKay, everybody. I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.